The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Morning, ladies and gents. Thanks for joining us. We're just going to give it a couple more minutes for a few more people to log on, so it won't be long. Thank you. Just give me a nod, Joe. Alrighty, hopefully everybody can hear me. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today. Hope you're all doing well. On behalf of Slattery Asset Advisory and Slattery Auctions and Valuations, it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to the first session in our inaugural webinar series. My name is Adrian Wong. I'm General Manager of Valuations. Today I'm joined by James Slattery, Director. Morning, James. How are you?
Well, thanks, Adrian. How are you?
Thank you. Thanks for joining us. And I've got Bruce Tykett here, National Manager, Insolvency, Banking and Finance. Welcome, Bruce. How are you?
Morning, Adrian.
All right. At Slattery, our mission is to be Asia Pacific's most trusted and dynamic partners in asset advisory. Given the unprecedented environment we're currently in, we thought it'd be timely to share some of our insights and experiences over the past few months to help you and your businesses going forward. So today I'll be covering off on valuation uncertainty during coronavirus. James will be addressing the road transport industry. Bruce will be talking to mining, earth moving and agriculture, and I'll finish up on the automotive industry. We will be covering off on some highlights from our quarterly report that was released last week and is also available on our website. A copy of this presentation and slides will be handed out to those who registered for the webinar. We do have a number of pre-registered questions that were sent through earlier, which we will address at the end. There is an opportunity as well. If you want to send through more questions on the webinar, we will get to these afterwards. So in terms of 2020 so far, from a valuations perspective, the number of valuations requests we received earlier in the year were pretty slow in January and February. However, we did see a strong spike in demand in March and the first couple of weeks in April. Since then, it's been fairly slow but steady. What has been interesting is the different types of valuation requests we are receiving. So typically we work closely with the banking, finance and insolvency industry. However, as many of you know, there's been moratoriums placed on clients who are in default. So we've seen different requests coming from, say, insurance claims, family law and acquisition activity. When I think back to the start of 2020 and some of the catastrophic events that have been influencing Australia, you think about the devastating bushfires and some of the severe floods. Neither of these two events really had a huge impact on the way we're approaching our valuations and our traditional methods. However, all along in the background, there was another significant threat to the economy that was brewing overseas and making its way to our shores. That was coronavirus. So as you know, most valuations contain some element of uncertainty. Valuation uncertainty can be defined as the possibility that the valuer's professional opinion as to the market value of the asset may differ from the price that could be achieved in a transfer of the asset as at the valuation date, assuming all other market conditions and variables remain constant. Valuation uncertainty can be impacted by three main aspects. We've got market uncertainty, model uncertainty, and input uncertainty. What we're dealing at the moment with coronavirus is market uncertainty. The coronavirus is a worldwide health crisis that is disrupting the global economy. The main challenges faced by valuers at the moment is the inability to rely on comparable sales prior to the coronavirus, as these may no longer be relevant. At Slattery, we're fortunate enough to be conducting our own sales and auctions, so we have relatively live data in relation to sale prices and asset values. So now we're going to spend some time to review the past few months and give you some of the insights that we have. So I'd like to welcome James Slattery, who's going to talk to the road transport industry. Thank you, James.
Thanks, Adrian. The transport market in Australia is pretty broad and complex. So and I know that there's going to be different levels of experience of the attendees. So what I was going to do is just do a quick industry snapshot, briefly talk about the new truck sales, move into used truck sales, predominantly in the heavy duty sector, with some examples, and then move into the secondary trailer market and try and make some predictions on what I think the future is going to hold for transport industry. So if we look at the industry snapshot, it's a mature industry. It's 47 billion in revenue, narrow profit margins. There's low barriers to entry, 46,000 businesses nationally. And then, Marion, can you hit next slide? Thank you. And you can see in that one of the last little bubbles up there, it says that the rail freight industry, it's anticipated to face a larger competition. That's been something which is said about the road transport industry ever since I've joined the business and been part of the auctions. And it just doesn't seem to really eventuate. So I think it's something that the industry is aware of, but road transport is definitely here to stay. And I don't think there's going to be too much disruption. There's talk about autonomous trucks and things like that. And I think that will probably prolong the impact of the road transport. But I think there's probably in the light duty market, there's probably more threat coming from the technology in drones and things like that. But that's sort of the industry snapshot. If you want any further details on that, we can delve a little bit deeper and just send through your questions either on the question panel on the right-hand side of the webinar, or you can text either Bruce, Adrian, or myself, and we'll try and get to your questions. But to set the scene as far as the new truck sales, which we need to do to understand what are the drivers of the used truck sales, is there was 2018 was the peak of truck sales in Australian history. Prior to that, it was 2007 pre-GFC, and it took up until 2018 for us to break the record. So what we saw in 2019, particularly in the first half, was people weren't able to get their trucks that they'd ordered the year prior, which meant that anything that was relatively late model or under that 300,000 kilometres was hard to get, which meant that we were able to sell second-hand trucks for new truck prices, which always leads to a little bit of a downturn. I'll get to that in the used truck sales. The second half of 2019, the orders all caught up, and then people weren't placing any orders. So they did start to struggle at the end of 2019. The May and June numbers for 2020 will be interesting to see. We didn't really have a lot of time in early 2020 post-Christmas to actually see what the market was doing before everyone had to rush off and panic buy toilet paper and hand sanitizer. So we did start to see a bit of an uptick, but it's all sort of been on hold and people have been focused on other things. We should see a bit of a spike in the numbers as far as what's happening leading into end of fin year. A lot of businesses will start to use the instant asset write-off scheme, which the government's increased from $20,000 up to $150,000, and they'll use that to try and solve some tax problems. So there should be a little bit of a spike. What we've seen as far as the manufacturers, both Kenworth and Volvo, they manufacture domestically. Volvo in Queensland, Kenworth in Victoria. And what they do is they have had to install social distancing measures within their businesses, and they have had issues with their global supply chains, which means that the factories have had to shut down, which means Volvo, Kenworth and Mack, Volvo build the Mack trucks out of Queensland. There has been a little bit of a delivery time on that. That will then translate into higher sales of the used truck market. But it is going to be interesting to see, as I said, what happens with the order book over the next couple of months. So if we move into the used truck sales, I spoke briefly about the first half of 2019 versus the second half of 2019 and the new truck sales numbers. We can see the new truck sales have decreased across all sectors, the heavy duty 23%, medium duty, all the way through down to light duty. Marion, can we go to the next slide, please? We can see this is the year-on-year truck sales numbers through each of the different market segments. And you can see 2018, 19 and 20 with the breakup there, just to highlight how sharp the decrease has been over the last 3 years. Next slide, please, Merritt. Righto. So you guys can read what's on the screen. I'll just give you a little bit of commentary in the background before I start to delve into that last little truck. It's a good example of what's actually happening in the market. We thought that Australia would be impacted by bigger lockdowns than what currently has been hit. You know, we saw what happened in China, Europe and New Zealand, and those lockdowns didn't really eventuate here. You know, trucks were exempt from a lot of the restrictions that normal businesses were put under, particularly in the border crossings. You know, they were able to continue to operate, and that commercial type asset was able to generate revenue for the businesses that held them, which meant that, and the wider market was able to see that the transport was critical, particularly if you think back to when everyone was waiting for toilet paper. You know, truck drivers were getting interviewed on the morning news programs to highlight the importance of that supply chain. People who had never used the word supply chain before were now starting to go, the toilet paper supply chain is whatever. And really just highlights how important trucks and trailers were in that time. You know, the hype and the fear around coronavirus and what it would do to the market was meaning that the values and the volatility in the values were changing frequently. So I spoke about the first half of 2019 versus the second half of 2019 and where we currently sit in the first half of 2020. So I'm going to use just a brief little example here just to sort of highlight how volatile it has been. We expected to get a medium duty truck that was selling for, in early 2019, would have been selling for about $30,000. In the second half of 2019, we were selling these trucks, similar style and make of truck, to 22 to 25. So there's a pretty significant decrease there. We valued it in February at 22 based on the recent downward trend in the market. So coronavirus hit, we're asked by our clients in that hype cycle to go, well, what's going to happen with the market? We were relatively conservative in that period. So we downgraded the value from $22,000 to $19,000 and we put it for sale in March, right in amongst when things were going a little bit crazy. And we sold it for $31,000. So not only did we revise it down and get it incorrect, the market really just stood up in that period where people were going, well, trucks are working, trucks are great, I should buy more trucks, and selling it for $31,000. So we did have to send a please explain letter through to the bank on that one. And I just use it as an example to highlight how volatile that truck market can be. A lot of businesses in that period, they weren't really servicing the supermarkets, but they had the systems, the assets and the procedures in place to be able to pivot to ensure that they got a piece of the supermarket panic pie that was available at the time. And that was really what was driving their revenue. I haven't seen the numbers as in the revenue and the profitability numbers yet. They will come out shortly. But you look at essentially the drivers of the industry and what makes it tick. We've got reduced traffic numbers on the road, substantially reduced fuel prices, low interest rates. And you really should see, or we should be seeing that translate into increased productivity and profitability across the sector because their costs are lower, their productivity is higher. So it really should translate into some strong numbers, which then translate into stronger asset values. So that's what we should be seeing on the ground. We've just finished our East Coast auction week. So Brisbane, Newcastle, Sydney and Melbourne have all just finished their truck and machinery auctions. And what we did see is that there is continuation of strong individual results mixed with high clearance rates across the board. So we are seeing that, but we also think that it is part of that government stimulus being the instant asset write-off being continued through to June 30. What we hope, well, certainly what I hope is that that does get continued. And this is the self-interest part is, and I'm sure a lot of you agree, is that it doesn't get announced until close to the date of June 30 because we want those sales to stay high. That's going to be a big economic of the driver. And then they announce that it is going to be continued. Whether that happens or not, I'm not sure. But I'm going to move into the older trucks. So, you know, that newer truck market has always been relatively strong, and it feels like it's something that we say relatively often is new trucks, low kilometre, late model, late technology sells well, and that's true. That remains true. But what's been difficult is that older type of truck, you know, the ones that fit into the category of 7 years plus in age, that are manual rather than an automatic transmission, that are 1 million plus kilometres. With what's going on at the moment, what we should see is that these trucks increase in their saleability. You know, where a truck is worth $30,000, and you can see it on the screen, the Mack Granite we sold for $30,000. That should probably stay around that $30,000 mark, maybe a slight uptick depending on what the farmers do. And Bruce will get into the agri sector later. But what it should do is it should mean that that sells quicker, and maybe for an uptick, maybe for a little bit less, but that turnover should be increasing across the market, which is particularly leading into June 30. So I just wanted to highlight and spend a little bit of time on that truck we sold out of Melbourne. It's a Volvo FH540, relatively popular truck. It's an automatic, which means that it's got pretty broad acceptance at the moment. We sold it in January. We referred it for 105,000 with a reserve of 130 in January. It was valued at 115,000, so the sale result was within that 10% market. The bank asked us to put it up again in February, and what typically happens is there is a bit of a drop. You know, the first auction is typically the best auction that you've got. It was referred for $95,000, so there was a slight dip. You know, you can have off auctions. In March, we put it up again, got $106,000, and we sold it. So it was sold. But what's happening is the finance fell through on that one. So we've had to put it back up to auction again, $105,000 sold. We're still waiting for the finance. So that should come in this week. But what's happening is, and what this does show is, it's relatively stable in that auction mark, a little blip in February, but relatively stable across the first few months of 2020. But now the issue is people getting their finance approved. You know, pre-COVID, it was relatively easy, money was cheap and accessible. Now there is a little bit of a restriction in that lending, so it's starting to become a little bit of an issue. And transport, you know, you go to buy and finance a truck, and you'll get the truck value relative. This is for ease of example. You spend $100,000 on a truck, they will finance the truck, the air conditioner, the rego if they can, and they'll just add everything in. So you'll end up getting financed for $115,000. That's what they try and do, and that is now being a little bit heavily scrutinised, which means that it won't be as accepted as much. So there is a little bit of a risk around when you're selling assets, whether the people you're selling them to will get the finance. But again, a lot of people will know that rings true for them and their experiences at the moment. So that's sort of the heavy-duty truck market in a very quick snapshot. I'm going to move into the secondary trailer market. Now, the prime movers that you get are relatively standard. You know, you buy the truck. There's some exceptions for fuel tankers and fuel trucks and heavy haulage. But when you get into the trailer market, what you'll see is that there is a greater segmentation of how trailers are then applied to the transport market. So, you know, just quickly, you have a breakup, which is general freight, refrigerated transport, heavy haulage, bulk cartage, tanker transport, and then within tanker transport, there's milk, fuel, gas, chemicals. Then you can get back into sort of container freight, horse transport or livestock transport, all these other different areas of the trailer market, which each have their own little industry segments and whether their values are increasing, decreasing, whatnot. So there's pretty broad range. I'm not going to go through all of them today because I'm sure that a lot of you will glaze over, or your eyes will glaze over, and there's other more pressing things. Check your emails while this is happening, you know, that sort of thing. So I'm going to stick to three. I'm going to talk about refrigerated transport, the general freight market, and then the heavy haulage. So refrigerated trailers, as far as their asset values go, are more seasonal than most trailers. You know, you think about the summer months and the demand for the grocery produce. Obviously, with what's just happened in COVID, they've been very busy and performed very well. But but you go back to the normal seasonality of these trailers, that September through to November is where these operators start to gear up and prepare for the transport requirement, or the uplift in the transport requirement over that period to service, you know, the Melbourne Cup functions around the country, the Christmas parties, the office parties, then the family Christmas parties, and then you've got the summer barbecues plus the Australia Day, and then it leads into just that really outdoorsy environment that everyone wants to be a part of, and they all go out and celebrate. That all has to be supplied by this segment of the market. So if you know, a lot of times people don't get the choice of when they do sell, but September through November is the peak in that period. You know, selling refrigerated trailers in the middle of a Melbourne winter, that's a much harder proposition than what selling these things leading into the start of the transport move. If you talk about the actual asset values and underlying what pins them, these things stay relatively stable for that sort of first 5 years. And then that 5 to 8 year mark is when they really start to drop off in value. They start to drop off because, you know, refurbishment cost is up to $20,000 per trailer. If you've got a fleet of 80 odd trailers that are getting to 5+ years old, then that is a pretty significant cost that you need to do. So you're best off turning them over. But what you'll find is in that 5 to 8 year mark, what's happens, because they're traveling such long distances and the roads aren't necessarily great, particularly if you're sort of North Queensland or over in the west, the roads there are much harder. But even doing that Sydney to Melbourne or Melbourne to Brisbane run, the bodies and refrigerated bodies twist and crack during that period. And what happens is the cracks then lead to condensation within the trailer, getting into the cracks, which then makes the trailers waterlogged. So you've got waterlogged trailers, increases the fuel burn of the truck, and just essentially decreases the profitability. You can do metro runs and things like that, but that interstate transport, they just can't afford to have the older style of trailers as they get cracked and damaged, and then refurbishment costs, those things. There's still a market for it, but it's anything that's 8 years plus in this, I mark them very hard when I go to value them, because they just seem to suffer. The operators don't really want to buy them unless they're in a bit of a jam. And those 12, 15+ year mark, that's where people buy them for storage. And once they're starting to get bought for storage, you know that there's really no use for them. So I'll move into general freight. And the market's been relatively strong for 12+ months in this. You know, we're getting something that's a little bit later model of 2 or 3 year old B double set taut liner with mezzanine floors or mezz decks. And they've been selling for 90% of retail or more, which is quite remarkable. When you get them into the auction arena, you have a month to market it, sell it, and get the funds back to the client. It's pretty impressive that you can get around that retail mark relatively easily. And you know, that's the benefit of being in business for a long time and having a good database and people following it. But that those trailers have just been really good property for a really long time. You start to get to the older type of trailers, again, you know, I classify that as that 10+ years, and they've been selling relatively well based on the lack of availability or what you need to pay for a new or a late model one out of the auctions. And they've been sort of around that 70-80% of retail mark for some time as well. You know, we've got a highlight, 09 MaxiTrans Step Deck, so 11 years old, and that taut liner sold for $41,000. So essentially 100% of retail. Where we've seen a bit of a dip in these things is where they need refurbishment or something like that. But again, it's not been preventative as far as selling these things. People are happy to buy it and do their own repairs, get their own fabricators out and get them back on track, and it's really not that big an issue. I'm going to start to move into the heavy haulage market, which is a good indicator and linked very closely to the performance of the mining and the mining services and the civil construction, just by the nature of what it is as far as dealing with the movement of machines and things like that. And it has been, again, quite strong. We've seen that segment of civil. There's infrastructure boom, and it's starting to be rumoured that that's going to be continued by a number of the state and federal governments. So it's almost been unaffected, and looks like that what has been a boom is going to be prolonged for some period. That requirement to move, say, a D6 dozer or a 20-ton excavator is definitely still there. The mines are still buying equipment and installing that. So that heavy haulage market is quite strong. You can see a couple of the examples which are on your screen at the moment. We sold a 3-row of 8, which is 3 axles, each axle with 8 tyres across it. It is a relatively lower spec type trailer, but again, very popular. It can do both civil as well as mining, so it's got a pretty broad application. And it was valued at $120,000, sold at $180,000. And part of that is to get that trailer new at the moment. You can place the order now, and it'll be delivered to you in December 2020. You know, if the market continues to be strong in that mining services, that can potentially blow out relatively quickly. But it is going to be interesting to see how conservatism starts to impact these types of industries, and whether they're going to just make do with what's already in the market, the second hand, and just try and get that initial price point a little bit lower. So that is performing pretty well. We talk about tippers, and tippers in the market. I know that there's a question coming up about this at the end of the once Adrian and Bruce have completed their segments. There is a question on tippers, so we'll leave it for that market. But tippers are a very important part of what we do, as well as what the banks and finance brokers do. So in saying that, I am going to hand over to Bruce to start to talk about mining and the agri markets.
We'll just wait for the clicker to kick in. There we go, we're back. Thanks, James. Some really good insights and a really good summary of a lot of different markets. The mining and earth moving industries over the first quarter of 2020 seemingly been one of the most resilient markets. We've seen a lot of mixed sentiment though. It was almost seemingly business as usual with a lot of the FIFO workers still operating, a lot of people in the construction industry still continuing on site, although using that social distancing measure. What we have seen though is a real change and some really mixed sentiment on since then. It was only last week that we saw a spike in the iron ore price, which would have been really terrific to help us drive out of the current COVID period, mixed in with sentiment around the tariff wars which are coming up between Australia and China, with Australian coal and Australian iron ore right at the forefront of that. A lot of industry participants have actually predicted that there's going to be around a 20% reduction in sales around the Australian mining construction machinery industry. And that sentiment has really been brought about by a number of different factors. The private capital expenditure reduction, and also the uncertainty which COVID has really brought into the marketplace. A lot of that has obviously been driven by what's happening in China. Regular readers to our quarterly report know that we like to reference the CAT results, and this sentiment has really been reflected by some of the recent Caterpillar results for quarter 1 2020. Compared to 2019, they were down around 21%, so a significant change in that marketplace. Closer to home and in the Asia Pacific region, Caterpillar has seen a similar reduction, although it's almost been double, as some of these figures will show you across the 3 different industries, which or 3 different segments which CAT usually operates in. So we've seen that reduction right across the newer market. So now moving into the secondary market, what's been the effect there? It has been pretty tough, particularly in the first quarter, when you're talking about mining equipment and also some of the largest civil assets. It has really slowed, and a lot of the assets which we're selling at auction have been passed in, and we've had to enter into negotiations with buyers after that point. So we'd expect to see around a 15 to 20% reduction in the price point for those larger civil equipment and some of the mining equipment. There are some current sales going on at the moment, so we'll make sure that we monitor them closely, and we'll also pass those details on to you in our next quarterly report. That said, there is some really good demand for late model, low hour machines. People love CAT, people love Komatsu, and they're very brand loyal. And some of the results which we've been seeing in that 10 to 15 tonne market has been really strong throughout Australia. You can see here in Queensland, there were a few assets which we did sell. And as I mentioned before, we had to enter into those negotiations with buyers afterwards. So overall, there are some good points in the small to medium size, and obviously some of the larger equipment is tougher to sell. Moving on to the agriculture industry. Agriculture has seen a real resurgence in the first quarter of 2020. A lot of that can be brought down to a couple of different factors. James mentioned the instant asset write-off, but predominantly the growth in sales in this market has been driven by the really good rainfall which we've seen across the east coast of Australia. When I mention the east coast, it's really important that looking at it from a national perspective, that we don't forget our friends over in Western Australia. And I'll touch on that because there has been a significant change in that market. And similar to the mining industry, there has been mixed sentiment. There's obviously been great rainfall on the east coast, which has driven those really strong sales. But the recent tariff wars, which have been in the press between Australia and China, in the barley industry in particularly, and flowing through the beef industry, is a bit of a watch and see. So again, we'll make sure that we monitor that over the current period and into the next. So machinery sales have improved throughout the first quarter, and it really has seen a bit of a lower impact from the COVID virus. The demand for raw food and the like has actually been pretty strong, and that's been reflected in a lot of the sales. While we've seen the rainfall in the east coast, as I mentioned, some of the sales which we've seen in that first quarter, it was a bit of a mixed bag. We saw a slight dip in February, and then March rebounded really strongly. And you can see here where that growth has been driven from. Obviously, predominantly across Victoria and New South Wales, with a slight dip in Queensland, but an even more significant drop in Western Australia. Some of the feedback which we've seen as well in the agri space has been that the April figures have been pretty strong. And as I said, it's almost a tale of two halves. While you've got New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria being really strong, some of the results out of Western Australia have been the opposite. We've seen a 40% increase overall thus far in the first quarter, and that has predominantly been driven again by Queensland, topping the pops at 78%, closely followed by Victoria and New South Wales. The figure which I've got for Western Australia is down 10%, but the recent data which has just come out in the last month has actually seen that spike up to around 40%. So now we've used tractor sales as a bit of a basis here, but some of the feedback which we've had in the larger agri equipment has been a completely different story. Larger assets like balers and headers have seen sales decline significantly. We've been out to a lot of regional areas across Queensland, Victoria, and New South Wales, and a lot of the headers and balers which were purchased about 3 or 4 years ago have never actually seen a crop. So it's unlikely that these assets are going to be renewed or purchased again anytime soon. So what have we seen in the secondary market? Again, we've seen pretty strong results, and the confidence which our buyers have been showing across the first quarter of 2020 has been absolutely terrific. We've got up here a few examples of sales which we've achieved over the first quarter. I'll let you go through them at your leisure, but you can see here that there has been some really strong results, and a lot of those have been in the East Coast. Why it's important to mention the East Coast versus the West Coast markets is that when we see an asset in the West Coast, we use the data which we've gained nationally to make sure that we are marketing the assets on the West Coast to our buyers on the East Coast, because that demand needs to be balanced, and we need to make sure that we're getting the assets to the right buyers. So in summary, it's quite good news for the agri sector, but as I mentioned, it is a real wait and see on the tariff situation, particularly as it's going to affect Western Australia. For those who don't know, the majority of barley is produced out of Western Australia. So again, we'll make sure that we keep a really close eye on that. and report to you in our next quarterly update or webinar. I'd like to hand over to Adrian now. He's going to touch on the automotive industry. So thank you.
John Bruce, thank you very much. Right, the automotive industry. In a nutshell, this is really struggling. This is a quote here from FCAI Chief Executive Tony Weber. The car industry is in crisis mode globally. We should note this isn't just due to coronavirus though. Sales in the last couple of years have been really weak. And in Australia, you can see that we've experienced 25 consecutive months of negative growth. On a year-on-year basis, you can see here that March sales in 2020 compared to 2019 were down around 18%. In terms of April, you can see that this year it's down nearly 50% year-on-year, and coronavirus has really bitten in and had an impact on the market. Again, with the Eastern Seaboard being the most heavily impacted, we've all seen sales declines of more than 50%. However, Australia, in comparison to the rest of the world, the global market has seen a decrease anywhere between 80 and 90%. And we're about to look at a couple of slides that will show this as well. As you can see here on this slide, that Italy, France and USA are showing real negative growth in terms of their car sales. This is March 2020, and you can see Australia on the left there is relatively okay. This next slide is the April data. And again, you've got the likes of Italy, France, USA, India reporting negative figures, and Australia faring okay out of all this. What's also interesting about this slide is that you may have noticed that there's less countries actually reporting their data, with many now choosing to report less frequently, say quarterly, as some of the data is not really encouraging and can be confronting. So it is a relatively subdued market, but did want to call out Toyota, who are pretty dominant in this quieter market. So in quarter one, they were holding nearly 27% market share. For the first time in history, Toyota actually held 5 of the top 10 car models in terms of new sales. These names would be familiar to most. So you've got the Hilux, RAV4, Corolla, Prado four-wheel drive, and Land Cruiser. Similar to this data, you can see that SUVs made up around 48% of sales in March. So the demand and appetite for this type of vehicle is still relatively strong. Right, onto the secondary automotive market or used car sales. So you would have noticed with coronavirus, with the lockdown measures, social distancing, car yards, showrooms are pretty empty. So similar to ourselves, car yards have had to rely on online methods. So in April, in terms of our auction prices, we saw them falling anywhere between 10 and 20%. We also saw the auction clearance rate dropping up to around 35%. No surprise, there has been a decrease in buyer participation. With regards to the wholesale market, a lot of car yards are trying to reduce inventories to shore up their cash flows. It's like they've been closing their checkbooks. In addition to this, we've seen more supply coming from fleet owners such as rental car companies. In a similar situation, they're trying to offload surplus stock to increase their cash. So when you think about the likes of the Toyota Corollas, Hyundai R30s, the Toyota Yaris's, there's been a bit of a flood in the second market for these, so that is having a negative impact on prices. Over the past few months, the building and construction industry has still continued to be fairly buoyant during the coronavirus pandemic. So we're seeing commercial values hold their own. For example, Toyota Hiluxes continue to sell quite strongly, anywhere up to 85% in retail value. Other well-known brands such as the VW Amarok are also holding strong prices. But on the flip side, some of the secondary or lesser known brands such as the Great Wall, we're seeing prices drop up to 30% in that market. No surprise, with the current environment, unemployment rates increasing, there has been a softening in the market for luxury cars in the first quarter of 2020. Just want to share this graph here. It's out of our quarter report as well, but just having a look at some of the figures in terms of prices held. You can see Toyota still featuring strongly there, the Volkswagen, even the Holden's being mentioned. So that's a quick snapshot of the automotive industry and just thinking about what the next sort of 6 to 12 months look like. I think from our perspective, we're still pretty buoyed in terms of the sales that we're achieving through our options. However, we are having to revise our valuations and working closely with vendors in relation to reserves and their expectations. So can't see any real improvements in this industry over the next 6 to 12 months. But what could be interesting to watch is as we're returning to some form of normality, it'll just be interesting to see how people are actually commuting around the place. There could be a reluctance or hesitant for people to use, say, public transport, taxis or Ubers. So whether this might drive increased demand for personal vehicles, not sure, but it'll be interesting to watch. So that brings us to the end of our formal presentation. And just in summary, as some of us have mentioned, there is flight to quality. While James talked about new truck sales struggling, secondary quality trucks remain pretty solid. Bruce covered off on the agri sector is pretty strong across the board with the rainfalls. And whilst mining is a bit slower, again, the good quality assets are still in demand. I've just covered off on the automotive industry, which is one of the hardest hit, and we need to watch this space. So all in all, this coronavirus is having varying impacts across different markets, and we have tried to address these in our quarterly report. Now, as I mentioned, we do have a few questions that we received early in the piece, so we'll just take a few minutes now to answer these. And let's see here, there's a question from Terence Redden of Westpac, and I might get Bruce to address this, please, Bruce.
Yeah, thanks, Adrian. So it's about technology and customers and how we're addressing it and repositioning ourselves. I think it really depends on the industry we're talking about. Manufacturing, actually, it doesn't matter whether you're talking about manufacturing or transport. Buying really good equipment, which is upgradable, particularly in the manufacturing industry, is really important. So looking at your customers of tomorrow, those are the things really need to be factored in. When you're looking at the transport side, I think the underlying theme of James's messaging was that you buy a Volvo or a Kenworth, it's fit for purpose. It's always going to be sold pretty well in the secondary market as long as it's well maintained. So I think as far as looking at tomorrow's customers are, aligning yourselves with the actual contract. If they're servicing a contract is really important, and looking at your utilisation rates as well, it's equally important, because if you've got an asset which is sitting idly by, it's better used in a cash position as opposed to waiting for that next contract to come out.
Thanks, Bruce. All right, Olivia, thanks for your question. So hopefully we have covered this off in our webinar and also our quarterly report, but if there is any other specific data or information you would like from it, please don't hesitate to reach out and we'll be happy to answer your questions. All right, thank you to W. Long Robson from RC Insolvency for this question. So this is obviously a challenging industry, the restaurant and bar space. So what we're seeing at the moment, that values and sales are okay in this regard. What the concern is the longer term, 3-6 months. So at the moment, you've got the likes of JobKeeper popping up in the industry. Some of the restaurants and bars have changed to takeaway, so that is popping up at the moment. But as some of the restrictions ease and the government subsidies aren't there, we are expecting maybe a bit of an oversupply in this. So thinking back pre-coronavirus, there was some bars and restaurants that were nearly closing down pre-coronavirus. So whether they take this opportunity to use that somewhat as an excuse not to open up, that's our concern down the track, and there could be an oversupply which push down prices. All right.
Hey, Adrian, I might jump in on that, and I'll touch on Olivia's question a little bit wider, as well as that whole hospitality industry. There's been a fair amount of press to say that they're doing it tough, and rightfully so. They definitely are. But what we haven't seen, and that's due to the change in the insolvency laws, is there's not that many which we have come across that are going into administration or anything like that. What's actually happening is there's been the sales that we have conducted in this space at the moment have actually been subscribed to really, really well. So we've tried to work out exactly what is driving it. We were very conservative on our valuations. We had a package of gear which sold for literally twice as much as what we valued it at. And that was because people are actually, and against all thought patterns, people are actually looking to open restaurants or looking to reinvest and refurbish their restaurants or takeaway outlets or whatever it may be. And they're doing that for a couple of different reasons. They have got the JobKeeper payment, so they've got subsidised rent. They may have had it in the works already to go through this, and this has just sped it up. And so they're actually buying and using these government subsidies to refit it. So to Olivia's question, as far as what asset classes are we seeing the impacts of, the first one is obviously auto. There's a lot of distress in that auto industry. We haven't yet seen that real blood on the floor yet for the hospitality industry, but we're expecting that, and that's going to happen around that September timeframe, where the government subsidies like JobKeeper and the timeframes around the insolvency and stat demands are going to increase, And that's where I think there probably will be a fair bit of supply hit the market. In saying we haven't seen too many, there's actually administration of a restaurant happening this afternoon where there's been some interesting developments as far as the suppliers of equipment aren't yet taking it back because the directors of the hospitality industries are looking to cut deals with the suppliers of those equipment. So everything else that we've been dealing with, and I know that's a very broad brush statement, is going considerably well. There's a lot of confidence out there. We deal with a lot of C-suite type businesses, or in that SME space, the owners, the people who make that purchasing decision, particularly on the auction side, as well as the valuation side. And there's a lot of confidence. People are actually buying. We're seeing globally. I know Terence Jacobs has joined us from TCL Asset Management out of Canada. I've been talking to Terence and some of the other North American auctioneers, and there is a lot of people who are turning up and buying online. It's not just that retail, but also that auction market. So there is a lot of liquidity out there, and there are people who are getting involved in a number of different purchasing decisions, which are updating their business or showing that they do have confidence that they're going to emerge. So I know there's talk in the economy about a V-shaped recovery. I'm not that smart to talk about that, but I do think that there will be a bit of a resurgence, particularly from what we're seeing in the purchasing decisions.
Cool. Thanks, James. Appreciate you elaborating on that.
Sorry, Adrian, back to you.
Not at all. Thank you. So question here from Daniel Attard from Westpac. So we haven't seen any, received any direct feedback from clients or financiers at this point. So typically it is about managing expectations. Even beforehand, clients are always thinking that their assets are probably worth a little bit more. The banks want to make sure that we're doing our proper due diligence and giving our best estimate in terms of what the valuation is. So we're just still doing our research, due diligence to make sure we deliver a quality product in terms of the valuation on that. And importantly, it's around, when did they purchase these assets? How old are they? And really understanding that they're looking to gear up against that. So that's not uncommon. We are seeing that, but no direct feedback at this point.
Yeah, I think the way they've been maintained is absolutely crucial. But what we are really we find really important is that if we are seeing a massive level of interest for a particular asset, doesn't matter whether it's a truck or restaurant equipment, is getting that feedback back to the actual client so that there's no surprise at the end of it. We had a couple of examples recently where some late model trucks went well over where we expected the market was telling us, and just making sure that people are aware of that level of interest from the inspection side, but also the bidding side is absolutely crucial. So you can obviously talk to people further up the line and manage their expectations.
Thanks, Bruce. That's great. And this last question from Tim Matchett at CPF. James, did you want to tackle this one, please? James frozen.
Oh yeah, no dramas. I mean, there has been a lot of media reports about the slowdown in building starts and even the cancellations. And I think that potentially there's a little bit of nervousness around that. The residential market looking like it's going to decline by sort of, some pundits are saying 10 to up to 30%. So there will naturally be a little bit of hurt and conservatism in that industry. And what that means, if the industry is a little bit conservative, then the assets which are used to underpin that will obviously be in a little bit of decline. Concrete pumps are pretty close to my heart. My first job out of school was on a concrete pump, so I like to talk about them as frequently as I can. But they're going to be used a lot in the infrastructure works. And if they're, those line and the boom pumps, they will be deployed in other areas. A lot of them are obviously used in that construction market. And what will happen, I'm not sure. I think that they will probably be, again, a little bit of conservatism. So the values will more than likely come off. So we just need a little bit of more data and a little bit of time under the bridge. The thing about valuations is they're very much an art, not a science. There's underlying data there. And you guys will obviously remember of my example of the medium duty truck and using those 6 months periods to talk about how the valuations can fluctuate. And it's definitely no different in that construction industry. So Tim, the second part to your question is about the tipper and dog combos that can cart gravel. They have been quite slow in the second half of 2019, and they are on the increase in value again. And that is mainly due to the next wave of infrastructure works which are happening nationally. And I think that people are starting to prep for that. During the infrastructure works, when they did start to be released, and the Metro, the Cross City Tunnel in Sydney, as well as the tunnels in Melbourne, and then the rail works, while that work was actually happening, people were buying old line haul prime movers, so that we're doing that Melbourne-Brisbane run that had heaps of Ks on it. They were buying it, extending the chassis, putting tipper bodies on the back. That has seriously come off, and I think that it will be a bit of a lead back into that sort of work once the next phases of infrastructure happens. Not yet happening yet, but we are starting to see signs that there is an uptick in those prices. So the future for concrete pumps, that's very much linked to the construction industry. As far as that tipper work, which again leads into infrastructure, depending on the body types. You can say a tipper, but if it's got a steel body versus an aluminium body, they're very different markets and very different values. So the infrastructure works, which is more the steel body tippers, they will start to increase for sure.
That's great. Thank you, James. Really appreciate that.
Long-winded answer there, Tim.
I'm sure Tim enjoyed that. Thank you very much. So just mindful of time, again, on behalf of Slattery Asset Advisory, Slattery Auctions and Valuations, thank you for joining us. We do intend on hosting another webinar, so if you've got any feedback or suggestions on what you'd like to hear, please reach out to your local Slattery contact. There's some details below. Again, thanks for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. Everyone. Thank you.
Cheers.